Boldwood presents Secret Spirit, written by Sally Morgan and read by Annie Aldington. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Introduction. The world has changed, and it will never go back to the way it was before. That sounds like a scary statement, doesn't it? But don't worry, change isn't a bad thing. People are incredibly adaptable, even those who think they aren't. Sometimes you just have to look at things from a different perspective. And life is rarely as simple as good and bad, or black and white. So there are lots of things to be thankful for in this new normal. With more people working from home now, hands up who will miss cramming onto public transport for the morning commute, being crushed between someone with bad breath and someone with bad hygiene. Thought not. Or how about all the social engagements you've been able to get out of by blaming the situation? We've all re-evaluated what's important in life, and generally it boils down to a few core things: security, health, and loved ones. As long as we've got these, and enough toilet paper and tinned food, if the early days of the pandemic were anything to go by, we're generally okay. If the pandemic showed us one thing, it is that life doesn't have to be so complicated and busy. Of course, it's lovely to be able to go out, to have some freedom, to travel and go on holiday. But as long as we have our health, our loved ones around us, and enough money to pay the bills, buy food, and make the occasional random Amazon purchase, we can survive, thrive, and find happiness. The rest are luxuries. The big lessons many of us learned are that we are more adaptable than we previously believed, and that we rely on people who were previously invisible to us. Think delivery drivers, supermarket workers, nurses and care workers. We also learned that kindness is a gift and a blessing, and it makes the world go round. Something quite incredible has happened since those first news reports broke in early 2020 about a strange new virus spreading through a city in China that few of us had heard of. There's been a collective awakening. So many terrible things have happened. So many people have lost their lives and lost loved ones. The tragedy has been on an almost unimaginable scale, but with it, we have seen amazing acts of love, kindness, and compassion. From the international level gestures of rich nations helping poor nations with vaccines, to the individual acts of love between neighbours and strangers who have reached out to each other to help the elderly and isolated. Then there were the collective acts of support, as thousands stood on doorsteps each Thursday night, clapping and banging pots and pans to show appreciation for the heroic NHS workers battling to save lives. It will take many years for us all to come to terms with events, to absorb and process it all and make sense of it. It will take even longer to work out where the virus came from and find ways to stop something similar happening again. Inevitably, the passage of time will dull memories, and as we get used to living with the virus, we'll return to lives similar to those we led before. We'll start to travel again. But we'll be a bit more cautious in the future. Offices will start to fill again, but will not be as busy as before. People will work from home several days a week. So, while things may feel the same, there will be subtle differences. For one, I predict that masks will remain quite a common sight for a long time to come, if not permanently. People will continue wearing them now, much as they have done in Southeast Asia for many years, where on public transport and in busy shopping centres they are commonplace. Remember how weird and alien they looked when the first people started wearing them in 2020, or how you'd give Asian tourists a second glance when you saw them wearing face coverings before the pandemic. Now we understand why they are a good idea. Social distancing is also here to stay to some extent. People will be much more aware of personal space and much less likely to want to put themselves in situations where they are crammed into enclosed spaces. These changes are obvious. There are, however, more subtle changes that aren't immediately obvious, but that will still have an impact on the way we live our lives. These are the changes in behaviour and awareness that affect the way we interact with each other, On a visible level, there will be less handshaking and more namaste hand gestures. On a deeper level, the world, I hope, will be a kinder and more caring place. Greater emphasis will be given to mental health. As individuals, we will be more aware of our own mental health, and as communities, we will be more aware of the mental health of others and the behaviours we exhibit that can affect this. An appreciation and greater awareness of mental health has helped people get through the pandemic. People understand much more now how things like loneliness, anxiety and depression are just as damaging to health as viruses. In a way, they are a kind of virus themselves. And by helping neighbours, listening to people who are suffering and talking about mental health more, we are on the way to developing cures. Mental health is not a taboo subject anymore, and that's a very good thing. We have mental health ambassadors now, like Prince Harry, of whom his mum, Princess Diana, one of my former clients, would have been very proud. The Princess of Wales was ahead of her time when it came to discussing mental health. More than anyone, she understood how destructive depression and anxiety are. She used to tell me how certain people in the royal household would change the subject whenever she tried to talk about how she felt, and how difficult she found living in what she believed was the gilded cage of royalty. She explained how, as a royal, you were expected to brush those kinds of feelings under the carpet. When I watched Harry and Meghan's interview with Oprah Winfrey, I got chills. It was like watching history repeat itself. It would be tempting to think that things don't change, but on the positive side they do. Because generally we now accept that mental health is something that needs to be nurtured and taken care of. And by sticking their heads above the royal parapet and talking about it, Harry and Meghan are helping drive the debate forward. People say that there is a mental health epidemic since the pandemic, and it is true that there are those who have suffered loss, ill health, isolation and anxiety as a result of the global health crisis. There will be millions who need help finding their equilibrium again. But there are just as many who would have been struggling before, who have been able to talk about it because the conversation has opened. People are searching for answers and for healing. There has been a huge emotional reset in the world. We've had a collective shock that has shaken us to our core and made us reconsider life in a way that we haven't since the end of the Second World War. We haven't yet started to understand the long-term metaphysical effects the pandemic will have on us. Generally, it will be positive. People will be more aware of their impact on others, both on a practical health level and on an emotional level. People want answers. They want hope. And for the millions who have lost loved ones, they want reassurance that those who have passed are at peace. And that's where people like me come in. I am a medium, or psychic. In the old days, I would probably have been called a witch and burned alive or put in a spiky barrel and rolled down a hill. Thankfully, the world is a bit more enlightened and forgiving nowadays, and instead I'm called upon to connect the living with the dead, or, to be more specific, to connect the living with the spirit energy of those who have passed into the realm beyond the one we live in. It is a place that feeds us and guides us, which all sounds slightly mad, I know. But trust me on this, it makes a lot of sense, and if you can harness this spirit power and so live a more spiritual life, good things happen. Given the events since 2020 and the way the world has changed, people are understandably seeking a deeper connection to their spirituality because they're scared and want reassurance. We've all had a very sudden and unwelcome introduction to our mortality. Humans are great at getting on with things, preoccupying ourselves with our day-to-day lives, and generally ignoring the fact that one day we'll all die. No one wants to be reminded of that, do they? And then, bang! Suddenly something happens, and every one of us gets a rather horrific wake-up call to remind us that we are fallible, vulnerable, and, in the scheme of things, quite insignificant. It's like a freezing cold shower for the mind, a proper shock to the system to sober us up. And now we need to look for deeper meaning and are forced to investigate the sometimes uncomfortable truth. The good news is that there really isn't anything to be frightened of. Life can be full of meaning and well lived, and death isn't the end. It is merely a transit point to a better reality, like Crewe Station, but with better facilities and a nicer first-class lounge. I sat down to write this book as life began to restart, because I realised that so many people were looking for answers and needed to try to understand what had happened to themselves and their loved ones on a spiritual level. Science and the news can only tell us so much. We can find out that the virus came from a bat or leaked from a lab. We can follow its trajectory across the globe, track its variants, deconstruct its genome and create vaccines. But on a personal level, answers are harder to find. Will I be okay? How can I be strong? How do I cope with the loss I've suffered? Where is my life going? What does the future hold? These are all much more perplexing and subjective questions. I hope that in the following pages I'll be able to give you some answers. And if I can't give you the answers, I can give you guidance on how to find those answers. Because when it comes to spirit energy, I can guide and explain. But ultimately, it's up to you to find it in yourself, because everybody can access their hidden powers, which are innate. They are naturally in us all. Spirit energy resides in us all and connects us to the universe. Don't get me wrong, I know this can sound a bit woo-woo when you hear it for the first time, but believe me, it's the truth. Inside us all there is a ball of spiritual energy, like a glowing Duracell, packed full of power. Most people only ever use a fraction of it. This book is about the secret of that spirit energy, how to tap into it, and how to harness your own spirituality. We get so much from it. It radiates love and hope. As a medium, I have this innate ability to be able to connect with you, even though you're sitting there and perhaps not even talking to me. Once you understand the secret of your spirit power, the possibilities are immense. I hope that by sharing my secret with you, I can give you peace of mind, strength, and a glimpse into another wondrous world. Chapter 1. Changes. The good news is that you don't have to be a fanatically religious person. I'm certainly not. You don't have to believe in a God with a flowing beard or miracles or biblical stories. There are literally millions of people in the world who have had some kind of experience or event that they would describe as spiritual or supernatural, and who are not religious at all. Likewise, many religious people will also have had experiences that are otherworldly and unexplainable, and which they will attribute to their religion. Religions have, after all, got a vested interest in the afterlife, but often their interpretations change because of historic or ecumenical factors. For example, in medieval Catholic Europe, ghosts were assumed to be the tormented souls of people suffering for their sins in purgatory. But during the Protestant Reformation, since most Protestants believed that souls went immediately to heaven or hell, paranormal activity was instead thought to be the work of angels, demons, or other supernatural beings. It was all about historical context. Today, belief in orthodox religions is on the decline in the West, but beliefs in spirits and the supernatural are as popular as ever. For example, a 2019 poll found that more than 4 out of 10 Americans believed that ghosts or demons exist, and over a third said they had felt the presence of a ghost or spirit. When it comes to ghosts, Mormons and Roman Catholics are the most believing religions, with 57% of followers of both denominations expressing a belief, while 52% of Muslims were also likely to say they believe that ghosts definitely or probably exist. Such beliefs are equally popular in Britain, where people are more likely to believe in ghosts than a divine creator. Believe me, the truth about spirit is fantastic enough. All you need is curiosity and to know that there is an energy field that connects everything and that will accept your own personal ball of spirit energy when it's time for you to go. But more of that later. This is the beginning, and we'll be taking the journey together. I started to really investigate spirit energy about a decade ago, after a lifetime of being a medium. I've always had what they call the gift, and it had led me along my path in life, as it does all of us. We all have the ability to use this gift of energy. We just need to be shown how. But as I got older, I wanted to understand more about what was happening to me when I performed psychic readings, and what was happening to the people I read for, variously called receivers or sitters. When I started touring my show in theatres, I became even more fascinated by the ability I had. Where did it come from? What was causing it? What strange power allowed me to connect with the spirits of people's loved ones and see aspects of their lives and futures that I couldn't possibly have known in advance? It is an incredible phenomenon, and one I was desperate to learn more about. My level of understanding began to grow deeper and deeper. I started looking at what I was doing differently. I took a more objective approach, which at first seemed bizarre, as I had always been someone who had bags of empathy, and had always invested emotionally in my work and the people I met. I still maintained that emotional link with the audience and the people I was reading for, but after the shows, I started to make notes about what had happened, and thought about theories that might explain the seemingly unexplainable. The pandemic put a stop to my theatre shows, and like the rest of the working world, I went online and started doing video readings. I also increasingly shared my gift through social media. What I discovered was surprising. I could still connect with the spirit energy of the people I was talking to, even though we were not in the same room. Often, we weren't even in the same country. Yet the information and messages I received came through loud and clear. My spirit energy Wi-Fi was like super-fast broadband, and none of the spirits I picked up came through on mute. As the months went on, thousands of people got in touch looking for reassurance and answers. I did hundreds of Zoom readings and realised that the world was desperate for some spiritual healing. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, I think it's safe to say that as a world we've become more spiritual. The pandemic asked questions of us that previously we chose to ignore. It might sound dramatic, but I truly believe we are on the horizon of a golden age of spirituality where each culture in its own way will endeavour to lead a more spiritual life. All through my life, Spirit has guided and helped me. It has led me to make decisions that have opened amazing possibilities. It's protected me, and in some cases, exposed me to risk, but eventually always led me back to the path I was destined to take in life. It's been my true north and my guiding star. It's been there for me through thick and thin, and now I want to share its secrets with you. A connection to spirit energy is different for different people. For me, as a medium, my connection is strong and allows me the ability to link to the spirit energy of others. For people who are just starting out on their journey, strengthening spirit energy will have a different effect at first. They will find themselves happier and calmer until eventually they'll start to develop the ability to recognise the signs from the world beyond this one. It's hard to describe what a psychic connection feels like, because I believe it's different for different people. For me, it starts with flashes of images and a feeling that something is building up in my mind. It's not pressure. It's a lovely feeling, like a gentle buzz in the back of my mind, like a single light bulb in a silent room. I can hear it in my head, but it's not quite noise, more like a current of electricity. The images could be anything, faces, buildings, scenes from someone else's life. And they come with emotions, usually love, sometimes tinged with other things, like sadness or laughter. For me, this is how the process begins. I open myself to it and invite it in, and as the energy builds, the images come into focus and get sharper. My field of vision sometimes blurs and softens at the edges. In my mind I hear sounds and voices. Sometimes I experience smells and touch. Every reading is different because every spirit is different. Each one I connect to is or was an individual. This is how it's always been since I was a little girl and had my first psychic encounter. I've always had the ability to see things that other people don't. It took me many years to understand what it was and how to harness it. When I was really young, I couldn't control it. It was my other world, my other reality, and the two existed simultaneously, which meant I'd often be at school in lessons sitting with my classmates and the souls of the dearly departed at the same time in the same space. It took me a few years to realise which was which, and to try to keep the two separate. On occasions, when I'd blurt out some exclamation or other because I caught sight of something unpleasant in the spirit world in the corner of my eye, the teacher would assume I was being disrupted and shut me in the supply cupboard. This was fine by me, because Ken lived in the supply cupboard. He was the school's former caretaker and had committed suicide in the Victorian era. I looked forward to our chats. My childhood was a real-life version of Rent-A-Ghost, full of jump scares, disembodied voices, and unlikely characters who had the disconcerting habit of fading in and out of focus. Today, thankfully, I can tune in and out of this constant other world that buzzes in the back of my mind like a swarm of bees, and generally I can turn it off completely when I need to get on with life on the earth plane. But every so often, the energy that drives the spirits in this place is so strong it barges into my mind. Some readings I do for others are so emotionally charged, so full of love or sorrow, that I can't close myself off or control them, and instead I have to surrender and feel everything. This was the case several weeks into the first UK lockdown, in May 2020, when I logged on to my computer to give a reading for a woman called Pam, who had contacted me the week before and booked in a session. It had taken me a few weeks to get up to speed with Zoom, and if I'm honest, initially I was sceptical. I had done telephone readings in the past, and they were always good, but for the previous 10 years I had been touring, taking my show to theatres around the country and doing readings for hundreds of people at a time. The energy and responses I received were amazing and, in my opinion, sustained the link between spirit, me and the audience. It was a cumulative effect. The more people, the more spirits, and the more intense the energy in the room, which led to better connections and messages. It was a feedback loop. I was so used to working this way with big crowds, I didn't know if I could go back to basics, like in the old days when I ran my mediumship practice from the front office of my suburban semi in Surrey, like Whoopi Goldberg in Ghost. But then Pam appeared on the screen, and I felt a jolt of energy that almost made me drop the glass of water I was holding. Immediately, in my mind's eye, I felt the image of a man. He was old, around 80, rather overweight, with kind eyes that shone out from his face. Sometimes I just get the blurry image of a face or the outline of a person. Other times, the messages come with a whole panoply of extra information. It could be smells, sounds, or background images. In this gentleman's case, I could smell disinfectant and hear a slow, rhythmic pumping sound, like bellows being inflated at regular intervals. Inhale, exhale. In many cases, I also experienced some of what the person in spirit was experiencing towards the end of their life. I assume it's like a residue that stays with them for a time after they pass. Over the years, I've got used to this, even though it's not always a pleasant thing to feel, particularly if the person in spirit met a painful or unpleasant end. When I was young, this could be distressing, like that time when I was working as a dental nurse, and I suddenly felt the presence of a woman standing over me who had obviously died from crush injuries sustained in some kind of car accident. There was a male patient in the chair who was under anaesthetic, and the spirit was a close relative who had no doubt decided to keep an eye on him while he underwent root canal treatment. I could feel her looking intently at him from behind me, and I carried on with my work as if nothing was happening. By that point in my life, I'd learned not to discuss what I was experiencing from the spirit world, especially in day-to-day life, for fear of being locked up. In this case, however, it became increasingly difficult to put our ethereal visitor to the back of my mind, because the more intense her concentration on the patient became, the more I experienced an uncomfortable pressure on my chest. As the dentist drilled and gouged his way deeper into the patient's molars, the pain in my chest increased, and I had to try very hard to control my breathing. I know the woman meant no harm, and she was there because she loved and cared for the man in the chair, who made a full recovery. But in a strange way, the manner of her death seemed to hang around her like a faint shadow. It didn't seem to bother her in the slightest, by the way. When we pass, the pain goes. But someone like me, attuned to the information held within spirit energy, can sometimes physically experience what that information tells me. I hope that makes sense. Perhaps another way to describe it is that spirits and their energy are in part like digital data. They hold memories and feelings in the form of information, which is formless in its purest manifestation, but which, when interpreted by a computer, i.e. a medium, is translated into physical and emotional elements, such as feelings and memories. So, back to Pam. Her Zoom reading, the elderly gentleman and the pumping bellows. As his energy grew, and his image became clearer in my mind, I also started to feel my breath become shallow. It wasn't uncomfortable or painful, and it was momentary, but definitely pronounced. "Why do I feel like I'm struggling to breathe?" I asked Pam. Given what was going on in the world at the time, I knew the answer before Pam confirmed it. The gentleman had died of COVID. It was my first experience of COVID loss. Sadly, since then, it has become a familiar feature to my work. "Oh, you poor love," I said to Pam. "He got COVID, didn't he? It was so quick." Pam was blinking back tears and nodded her head in affirmation. "He was your dad," I said. She nodded again. There was such a strong bond between the two, it was obvious to me that they were father and daughter. I'd felt the same kind of pull thousands of times before. From spirit, I was receiving broken images of a life of love lived together. A babe in the arms of a beaming, proud father, a child on a bicycle wobbling away from the steadying hands of her father, a graduation, a family holiday, a grown woman in tears comforted in the embrace of her dad. The man was showing me his life, and mixed in with all these images and emotions, there was someone else. I could feel her too. "Is your mum in spirit too?" I frowned. It wasn't immediately clear because the link between Pam and her father was so solid and clear. But in the periphery of my mind, I could sense another energy source growing in strength. As it got stronger, I started to see the outline of an elderly female face, soft-lined and smiling. As she came into focus, I could see she was the spitting image of Pam. And once again, I felt the tightness in my lungs. "Oh, my God!" I gasped, unconsciously putting my hand on my heart and inhaling deeply. "Your mum died of COVID too, didn't she?" Pam explained everything. Her dad had been a victim of the first wave and had succumbed to the virus in mid-April 2020. He was 83, and even though he was fit, he was no match for the disease. He had a temperature and shortness of breath for several days, which got worse, until he was taken into hospital on a Friday afternoon and placed on a ventilator the following morning. By Monday, he was dead. Meanwhile, his wife, who had recovered from cancer 3 years before, also contracted the virus and was taken into hospital shortly after her husband. They were both in the same ward, unconscious and on ventilators. We couldn't go in and see them. Pam explained through her tears. Her grief was palpable. By now the information was flowing through me. I could feel an unbreakable bond of love between the two spirits. I knew they'd been married for a very long time and were so close they were almost one being. That's one of the beautiful things about true love. Obviously, the fireworks that go off at the start of a relationship are great and exciting, but when they fizzle out, which they always do, they are replaced by something much more valuable. True love is an indestructible glue, and when we find it, it lasts a lifetime and keeps us together into the afterlife. They were married so long, I told her. They knew everything about each other, and they loved you and your brother so much. I'd worked out from what I was feeling that Pam had a sibling. "We begged the hospital to let us in, just to say goodbye," said Pam. "The nurses held up an iPad and let us speak to them, but by then they were both on ventilators and in comas. They had tubes down their mouths, and all we could hear was the sound of the machines." Pam's immense grief was mixed with frustration and anger. "I never had the chance to tell them how much I loved them. I never had the chance to say goodbye," she sobbed. "I can't bear the thought that they died alone, hooked up to machines." The waves of love I was receiving from the couple in spirit were intense. They didn't want their daughter to suffer. "They know how much you love them, darling," I soothed. They want you to know they are at peace and in a beautiful place, and that they hear you when you speak to them. I talk to them all the time. Pam smiled through her tears. And they want you to know that they didn't die alone. They were together. When your mum passed, your dad was there waiting for her. You don't have to feel angry. They are together now, and always will be. Since that first COVID reading, the numbers increased almost daily to the point that a year into the pandemic, and I was receiving daily requests for video readings from people who had lost loved ones to the virus. Most of them followed a similar theme. The first thing anyone who has suffered the loss of a loved one wants to know is whether their loved one is okay and at peace. They always are, because when we pass, we go to a place of love. The other common themes I noticed were frustration and helplessness from the bereaved, and sometimes anger. This is understandable given the nature of the deaths, especially in the first wave when it was such a new disease and doctors were still trying to find the best ways to treat it. There was a lot of fear in the world, and fear does strange things to people. Scared people don't think straight, and when we're scared and don't understand things, we start to look for answers in unlikely places. That's why, in my opinion, so many people have become obsessed with conspiracy theories. They look for ways to explain the unexplainable, and their judgment gets clouded. I read a newspaper report that said most people who believed COVID conspiracy theories have degrees and are university educated, so they're not stupid people. They just get obsessed by an idea. Personally, I think there may have been human error involved in the pandemic, and it wouldn't surprise me if, in time, we find out that it did get released from a laboratory, maybe by accident or negligence. But we won't discover the full facts for decades. The world has experienced a collective wave of negative emotions, fear, frustration, anger. All these things are bad for spirit energy. They create doubt, and people become closed off. The good news, however, is that these negative aspects of the pandemic are short-lived and are far outweighed by the good that the world has experienced. All the love, compassion, and kindness we've seen has created an awareness of how good it feels to be kind and to love each other. These are just the kind of qualities that nourish spirit energy, as you'll discover later. People's spirituality has been awoken. Many of us have rebalanced our lives and reevaluated what is important to us. One of my friends, Jackie, was on the brink of divorce before the pandemic. She had 2 young children of school age and worked full-time in the events industry. They were looked after by a childminder after school, and she got home just in time to put them to bed. Her husband, let's call him Jake, worked in the city, put in long hours and earned a good wage. He hardly saw his wife or kids during the week, and would often do a few hours of work during the weekend. Even when they were together, they were not present, because they were so preoccupied with work and the stresses of everyday life. Therefore, they just drifted apart. There was nothing inherently wrong with their relationship. No one had an affair. They just stopped being together and assumed that was the way life progressed. In a warped way, they equated material and financial stability with success. But spiritually, they were both withering away. Jackie confided in me that she was thinking of leaving her husband because they were more like friends than a couple. She felt something missing, and when she thought about the future, she could only see the situation getting worse. Jake, a typical man, did his best to ignore things, but deep down knew there was a fundamental problem with his marriage. Then the pandemic hit. Jackie was furloughed. The kids' school was closed, as was Jake's office. He was ordered to work from home. They were lucky enough to have space in their house for a home office and also had a garden. I think all those families who lived through lockdown and homeschooled in flats were heroes. Jake and Jackie found themselves suddenly thrown together as a family unit for the first time in many years, with time on their hands. And at first it was tough. They were worried about their jobs and dreaded the idea of having to become teachers to their kids, who incidentally loved the idea of not being in school. They had to pull together, work as a team, live as a family again, and learn to enjoy the simple things in life like walks, games, and baking. In this, they were the same as practically every other household.